your issue isn't that you need to turn over a new leaf. Your issue isn't that you simply need a makeover. You don't need a tune-up. You need a resurrection. You need to be regenerated. You need to be born again.
You must be born again.
Christian theology has always taught what is called the order of salvation. Scripture does not refer to all of salvation as a one-time event, but rather it teaches that there is a process. There is a progression of events and order revealed in Scripture. Some passages of Scripture may refer to one or two elements of salvation, while another passage speaks of a series of elements. For instance, Romans 5:1 speaks of justification and faith and their relationship or order. Faith is viewed as the means through which justification flows. Thus, faith must precede justification. In Romans 8:30, Paul gives us a longer list of the order of salvation. You will notice that Paul discusses justification here, but leaves out faith, just as he speaks about justification in Romans 5:1, but leaves out glorification. No one passage mentions all of the elements regarding salvation. Nevertheless, you will see a clear ordering of events in this verse. Justification is not glorification. Glorification is not adoption. Adoption is not sanctification. Each element is distinct to the others, but are all related to one another in some fashion. Moreover, some elements are a one-time event, such as justification, while another is ongoing, like sanctification. Some elements are past events in the believer's life, like regeneration, whereas glorification is yet future. For more on the order of salvation, please read B.B. Warfield's Plan of Salvation and Dr. Robert Morey's Studies in the Atonement. Now, the reason for showing that Scripture speaks of an order of salvation is because to get the order wrong will radically affect one's theology. Obviously, placing glorification prior to regeneration would result in serious error. The importance of this is seen most dramatically in the Calvinist and Arminian debate between the relationship of faith and regeneration. The Calvinist says that regeneration is prior to faith, while the Arminian claims that faith is prior to regeneration. The implications of this are enormous. In the beginning of this video, we saw a series of pictures relating to the processes of life. We began with an old man and finished with the birth of a child. Clearly, before any of the other things can take place in a person's life, one must first be born. You cannot take your first steps unless you have first exited your mother's womb.
Ask yourself, what did you do before you were born? Did you learn how to read while in your mother's womb? Perhaps you crocheted a baby sweater while the cold world outside waited for you to be born. Surely some of you, while bobbing around in that watery enclave, you took up fishing. No? Well, these things and walking, riding a bike, getting married, and growing old cannot be done until after we are born. To assert one receives and exercises faith before they are born from above is just as ridiculous as placing the event of having your first beer and cigarette legally at 21 before you're born. It's not only impossible, it's utterly stupid.
Now, there is only one aspect of salvation that Scripture refers to as birth. That is, of all the elements of salvation, Scripture uses the metaphor of birth only with regards to regeneration. The significance of this is glaring, yet most professing Christians never grasp the weight of it. This was not a mistake on the part of the authors of Scripture. It was quite deliberate. Anyone listening to the apostles or reading their books would be familiar with the concept of birth. Birth must precede all else. The authors of Scripture could not have made this any easier to understand. They chose something every living person with an IQ above that of a snail could understand, and used it to describe how salvation begins. Yet, despite the simplicity of this, the majority of professing Christians completely miss it. Understanding Scripture to be the final authority on what we are to believe and how we are to live, we need to look to Scripture and see if it anywhere teaches that regeneration that is, the new birth, comes prior to faith. Since Dr. James White already has an excellent video dealing with 1 John 5:1, I will simply refer you to that video and leave the link in the description box. Here, I would like to address a passage that, ironically, is a favorite of the Arminian, and not only demonstrate how their understanding of the passage is in error, but that it actually contradicts the very thing they claim it teaches. Arminians love to quote this verse as they believe it justifies their understanding of the relationship between faith and regeneration. They understand, and rightly so, that to receive Him is synonymous with having faith. However, they err when they conclude that becoming children of God is the new birth or regeneration. Becoming a child of God is not regeneration, it's adoption. Let's look at a few Bible dictionaries which will make this clear. Although the new birth is necessary for adoption, some theologians distinguish the act of adoption from regeneration. Regeneration is this act of God by which an initial and radical transformation of a sinner occurs so that a person once dead in sin becomes alive in Jesus Christ. In contrast, adoption does not refer to the experience of transformation of a sinner. It is a legal term describing the right or power granted to a transformed believer to become God's child. And in Romans 8:15, adoption refers to becoming children of God. Paul employs the concept as a judicial metaphor with important theological implications. Familiar with the Roman legal custom of adoption, the apostle extended the concept to illustrate that the acceptance of faith brought the believer into the family of God as an adopted child, one who obtained sonship in a secondary or derived sense. Finally, Paul reflects that it is ultimately God who purposes that believers will be as sons through Jesus Christ. Adoption is implicit as a relationship of grace in John's teaching about becoming a son. To become a son or child of God is the act of adoption, not the new birth. Understanding this, no Calvinist denies nor has any problem with faith preceding adoption. Thus, John 1:12 provides no hindrance to our position. Since John 1:12 is not discussing the relationship between faith and regeneration, this verse, all by itself, is irrelevant to the debate. Only when we couple verse 12 with verse 13 do we understand the relationship between faith and regeneration. The Arminian never quotes verse 13, and verse 13 is the answer to the question. Notice here the word born. It is at this point where John discusses the new birth, and he specifically denies man's active role in this birth and attributes it wholly to God. It should be quite obvious that John is speaking of an order of events here. However, he does it in the reverse. First, he explains how people of faith are adopted as children. Then, in the next verse, he goes back one step and explains how these adopted children are born. In other words, faith and adoption don't come prior to the birth, but the birth comes prior to faith and adoption. Faith does not result in the new birth, but results in adoption. One who is yet to be born cannot have faith or be adopted. This should be obvious, and to believe otherwise completely misses the point of God using birth as a metaphor for regeneration. It turns the whole understanding on its head. Were born is in the passive voice, which means the subjects, those who were born, are being acted upon and not performing the act. The word will in nor of the will is the Greek word which means desire. In other words, John is explaining the passive role persons take in the new birth, so much so that he specifically rules out the will or desire on the part of said persons having anything to do with the new birth. God causes a person to be born, and it does not stem from anything the person does, believes, or desires. Kind of like physical birth, no? Are not people completely passive in their physical birth? Is it the baby's desire, belief, or effort that leads to their birth? Or are they pushed and pulled from the womb, being acted upon by another? In conclusion, Arminians fail to understand the order of salvation as a whole, and fail to understand John 1:12 in particular. Arminians would have us believe that a child learns to walk before ever leaving its mother's womb. Not only is such thinking contrary to common sense, but more importantly, it is not in line with the revealed word.